Chapter 21. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Meanwhile, Gideon, Bardas, and the rest of the Moonlight Knights chosen to escort Darius continued traveling by horses as caravans carrying gifts for the bride and groom followed behind them. Something is weird, Gideon. I can feel it, Bardas grumbled before shooting Gideon a threatening glare. You seem to know something, so you better tell me now or I won't stop bugging you. Gideon gulped but casually replied, You're overthinking things, Bardas. Nothing is weird. Just focus on our journey. Our elders back home assumed that the kingdom of Ebodia might propose a marriage alliance between our king and the second princess, Bardas pondered. If that were to be the case, do you think His Majesty would agree to it or still proceed with the selection for a queen? Either way, he doesn't believe in soul mates or mates pull, so I guess accepting a princess from another kingdom will be possible. Well, we all know how our king is someone who is very hard to read. We'll find out eventually once the king of Ebodia has a private talk with him after the wedding ceremony, Gideon neutrally answered. In all honesty, he, too, was curious about what would happen next and how their king would actually handle such a proposition. It is exceedingly rare for him to heed a request. I mean, he hated shape-shifting, but he did it willingly just so he could accommodate his new warrior. Servant Zen, Bardas continued. I truly feel that something is off. Is he that fond of that lad? I mean. I don't know. Our king is really acting peculiar, don't you feel the same? Bardas scoffed. It was simply patently weird. Gideon also couldn't fathom that their king would travel in his wolf form and leave them behind just because a lad asked him to. He let out a sigh and said, Stop thinking nonsense, Bardas. I was with him and personally witnessed how well the lad fought all those rogue werewolves off alone just to save the innocent. He's really skillful, and you will be amazed at how strong and agile he is despite his small frame. Bardas didn't comment, but the doubtful expression on his face showed that he was far from convinced. Looking at his unconvinced face, Gideon eventually decided not to say anything more. Among the king's Moonlight Knights, Gideon was the closest to the king. Thus, Gideon could easily read the king's mind just by watching his expressions alone. If Gideon was right with his interpretation, he understood why their king wanted to keep the lad beside him. Pursing his lips, he tried not to make a meaningful grin while knowing why their king acted so grumpy over anyone who wanted to approach the young lad. Their king's possessiveness over Zen was showing, and it was certainly not because of the fact that the king had claimed Zen as his. However, something still didn't sit right with the whole situation. Was their king's wolf mistaken? Or was that stubborn wolf pranking their king? He didn't dare open his mouth regarding this sensitive topic, or else the king would probably punish him severely. Well, the king may not physically punish him, but Gideon was sure that he would still suffer so much that it would make him wish for death. As such, there was absolutely no way that he was going to say anything. He was sure that Darius's wolf, Zeus, convinced their king to only ride on one horse just so he could smell Zen's scent more. Gideon could not help but chuckle, imagining the dilemma that their ruthless king might be experiencing right now. And sure enough, back with Darius and Xenia, Gideon was absolutely right. Currently, Darius and Zen were back to traveling by horse with Zen sitting in front of him. It was devious, but it was an inconspicuous way in which he could hug and breathe in Zen's scent to his heart's content without raising any suspicion. Darius was slowly getting aroused for reasons he couldn't understand. Somehow, looking at Zen's naive expressions a while ago when he shifted back to his human form, made him hard as heck. He simply blamed his wolf, Zeus, for it. Although, what if Zen turned out to be a man and saw his erection? It would be so embarrassing and shameful. I already told you. Zen doesn't smell like a man. Didn't you feel how supple her lips were when you accidentally kissed? Zeus growled. That smack of their lips had indeed turned him on so much that his body craved for more of such interactions with the lad. Wait. Catching his thoughts once more, Darius mentally scolded himself. He was struggling hard because of Zen's closeness. Darius growled as he tried his best to control the beast within him. He wondered if he had been celibate for too long that his lust would instantly flare up just from a simple biting of the lip by this seducing ingrate. So many perverted thoughts ran inside his head. Oh, how he wanted to bite those lips and wet them with his own saliva when Zen smeared the sauce on her face a while ago. He unknowingly even let out a lusty growl that Zen heard. The struggle to control his wolfly instincts and refusal to act on them was the worst dilemma in his life. Darius instantly chastised himself when his thoughts turned into that of a pervert in broad daylight. It was ridiculous. Before, he used to tease and make fun of some of his men who couldn't fight off their urges when it came to their mates. But right now, since he was experiencing the same thing, he now knew full well that he was wrong to tease them. He wondered if it was karma biting him in the ass. Cursing himself in his mind, he lamented letting Zen sit in front of him, not that his body seemed to mind at all. "Tell me, Zeus. Are you somehow playing a prank on me?" Darius helplessly asked his wolf. "How long will you be in denial, huh? It's the mate pull whether you believe it or not. Just admit the fact that you desire Zen and please, this will be the last time I will say this. She's our mate and she's a woman. Let's have that benefit of the doubt. Still, to see is to believe is more logical, don't you think, Zeus?" Darius scoffed and was answered simply by an annoying and impatient growl from Zeus. Chapter 22. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Do you think that we can reach Abodia in less than 5 days if we keep traveling in your wolf form during mornings, your majesty? Xenia suddenly asked. She heard him sigh, then he added, "You seem very excited and eager to reach Abodia. Must I remind you that you're stuck with me, Zen? Don't forget that your life is mine." Xenia frowned as she mused, why is this king so possessive of a mere lad? She almost wanted to shake her head in exasperation with the king's actions. But then again, if they followed traditions, Darius had a point, since she would technically be dead if he refused to rescue her. In that sense, she indeed owed him her life. However, her pride refused to let her accept that she was at the mercy of someone else. And it was not only her pride. She was a princess, for goodness sake. She had royal blood flowing in her veins. How could she owe her life to someone else? Once she was home, she would simply have to reward him for his kindness and help him when he needed it. That should be enough for him to let me go, right? Xenia was actually not familiar with all of the rules and orders of kingdom politics. Unlike her sister, Mani, she focused more on training her body and improving her skills rather than reading books. She loathed politics. It was why she disagreed with marriage alliances in the first place. But in the end, she supposed that she still couldn't escape one, when it came down to it. "Do you have family in Abodia?" Darius suddenly asked. Xenia was caught off guard, but she genuinely replied, "Yes." "So what made you decide to become a wanderer then?" Darius pondered. "Because I'm trying to escape a dreadful fate, dreadful fate. Yes. Being caught up in an arranged marriage is the worst," Xenia grumbled. "Arranged marriage?" Xenia rolled her eyes and mused, why is he repeating after me? "Won't your family notice you?" Darius inquired further. "No, they won't. We'll be going straight to the castle." "Where did you learn your fighting skills? Given your talent, I'm sure you would have been a warrior for Abodia," he asked. Your fighting skills do not look like it came from self-taught training. And your sword? I can tell that it's not ordinary. An A-caliber double-edged sword. It's not something that a normal person would be able to afford." "Your Majesty. If you don't mind, I would prefer keeping some aspects about my life private, especially regarding my personal matters. I hope that His Majesty will respect my choice. All I can say is that I'm a wanderer." Xenia let out a sigh of relief when the king finally stopped asking too many questions. As the dusk drew near, they stopped by another village to eat dinner. Then they looked for a good and safe inn where they could sleep for the night. "I need one room. And please provide us a bath and sleeping clothes for the two of us," Darius instructed the innkeeper, making Xenia's jaw drop. "Your ma." He glared at her, making her shut her mouth out of fear. Avoiding his gaze, Xenia gulped. She couldn't believe how ridiculous this king could act when he wanted to be. Acquiescing to the king's demands, the innkeeper led them to their room, where they were introduced to their amenities. By the time the innkeeper left, Xenia could no longer hold her protest in. "Your Majesty, are you sure we should sleep in the same room? It is so inappropriate." "Inappropriate in what sense?" "You're my personal servant after all," Darius nonchalantly commented. "Would you do your job this time, Zen? I hope that you won't act weird and suspicious again," he scolded. Xenia gulped as her face paled. She had to remind herself that she was still in disguise. What does a servant warrior even do, she wondered while assessing the situation. There was a knock. Opening the door, the innkeeper, with his helpers, informed them that they had provided them with a warm bathtub and clean sleepwear clothes. After all was said and done, King Darius quickly dismissed them. He then turned to Xenia and said, "Help me undress." Xenia quickly walked towards him. With a gulp, she tried to calm all of her trembling nerves as she prepared herself. If she wanted to put on her disguise, she would need to gather herself and continue with her act. "Maybe things will become easier once I tell him the truth. I should tell him that I'm a woman and this is all just a disguise," Xenia contemplated before quickly dismissing the notion. From what she could tell, Darius was a possessive werewolf, owning her life as a lad. If he found out that she was a woman and a princess, he might become even more possessive of her, possibly reinforcing his belief that her life was his now. It was just intuition, but still, she couldn't risk it. Darius's piercing gaze was so intense that she could feel the loud pounding of her heart in her ears. She had never been this close to any man, even more so with a bare-chested man. Hesitatingly, she raised her arm to untie his cape. Her movements were so fast that she barely breathed in an effort to avoid lingering on his muscles. She then quickly turned to hang his royal cloak into a dress stand present in the room. Turning back to the task at hand, she gulped as she looked at his trousers. This was bad. He was obviously waiting for her to remove it. Taking a deep breath, Xenia forced herself to calm her trembling hands as she walked closer to him and reached for his trousers. Taking another deep breath, she was about to remove it when she suddenly thought of a brilliant idea. In one swift motion, Xenia faked a good feint. To her horror, however, instead of falling on the ground, Darius was too quick in catching her body. "Keep your calm and don't move your eyelids," Xenia reminded herself as she kept up the act. There was a long pause that followed, and she suddenly found herself regretting why she even did something stupid like this. Lying still was unironically making her die out of nervousness. "What's taking him so long to put me down on the bed or the ground?" Xenia silently screamed. Chapter 23. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In one swift motion, the king carried Xenia in his arms towards the bed. "What is wrong with you? You should be the one serving me, not me carrying you like this." He then gently put her on the bed and murmured, "Stay here while I call for a healer." Hearing him, Xenia panicked, thinking that her disguise would be blown by a healer looking after her body. As such, she immediately opened her eyes. Xenia froze as their eyes met. There was only an inch of distance separating their faces from each other. "You're good now. What happened?" King Darius questioned with snapped eyebrows. "Your Majesty, can you move?" "I can't breathe," Xenia whispered. At her words, he quickly moved away and stared at her in disbelief. "Explain," he demanded. Xenia sat up on the bed and said, "Oh, this happens to me often. You see, I have this illness." "What?" he burst. I have this fear of nudity," Xenia murmured with a slight bow of her head, hoping desperately that the king would buy her alibi. A moment of silence followed, but a bout of loud laughter from King Darius broke through the tension. Hearing him, Xenia raised her head to look at him. "Are you being funny right now, Zen?" "Because it's actually effective," King Darius heartily chuckled. He had probably never heard of such an absurd illness like that in his entire life. "But I'm serious, Your Majesty. I tend to faint, but it's not always like this. Sometimes, I experience difficulty in breathing just like a while ago when you suddenly shape-shifted back in your human form," Xenia desperately explained, keeping firm eye contact with the king to convince him that she was dead serious. She had honestly heard of such a case from a mage friend, Jaira, in their kingdom before, that someone having that disorder had asked for help from her to treat it with her magic. "This is why I became a wanderer, Your Majesty. To find a cure for this illness," she morosely said. "I wanted to have my own family and have a life partner, but this illness will prevent me from having that. So if Your Majesty will be considerate enough, then please let me assist you in anything that does not involve any nudity," she bravely requested. The king's intense and scrutinizing gaze made goosebumps appear all over her body. However, she had to meet his stare to convince him that she was dead serious about what she just said. Darius's eyes narrowed as he incredulously asked, "Fear of nudity? I didn't see you having problems talking with my bare-chested men a while ago." Xenia purposely shrugged her shoulders as she emphasized, "Your Highness, I'm referring to nudity as in the whole body from head to toe, like when you shape-shifted back into your human form a while ago. The chest is tolerable, but I can't handle seeing your whole body naked." She sagely continued, "I almost died a while ago, but I managed to keep myself calm since I hoped that His Majesty wouldn't see this weakness in me. But tonight, I couldn't help myself from fainting just from the thought of removing your last piece of clothing. Feel free to assign me to any personal chores like feeding you or anything, but please don't make me undress, bathe you, or help you in getting dressed." There was a wry smile on him as he denoted with lifted brow, "All the more reason for you to complete such tasks so that you can overcome that kind of disorder, Zen. I will help you conquer that fear." "Is he for real?" Xenia inwardly retorted, utterly speechless with how persistent the man before her was. She was just hopelessly debating with this man at this point, who seemed to not run out of answers to everything. "But," Xenia murmured. "No more buts. This is for your own good as well. Who knows? I could be the answer to your disorder," King Darius scoffed. "The best way to conquer your fears is always to face them head-on without hesitation. I won't mind watching you faint over and over again till you will eventually get used to it. And who knows? You might end up not fainting in due time whenever you see full-body nudity. Darius moved without batting an eye. No one knew what he was thinking with his stoic expression as his eyes never left hers. He then started removing his trousers in front of Xenia. Her face paled so hard that she immediately closed her eyes, tightly shutting them off from the world as she squealed, "I'm sorry, Your Highness, but I'm not ready to die just yet. I assure you that I will lose all the air in my lungs if you continue stripping in front of me like that." Darius carefully studied Zen's expression, and he frowned as he moved to undress on his own. He then irritably dipped his body in the tub filled with warm water. "You're the weirdest person I've ever met," the king commented. Xenia let out a sigh. With her eyes shut, she couldn't see but she felt the king's gaze as it still lingered on her. From the sound of footsteps and splashing water, she assumed that the king was already taking care of bathing himself. She could also hear his silent curses, and she unconsciously bit her lower lip in response. She could only hope that the king wouldn't torture her for another night like this. They would have approximately 4 days and 3 nights of traveling by horse left, if she was right, before reaching the kingdom of Ebodia, presumably before nightfall. But if they continued traveling during the day in the king's wolf form, they could probably arrive a day before the wedding ceremony, giving her more than enough time to correct her mistakes and save her sister. Her shoulders dropped at the thought of how she would continue convincing the king to travel in his wolf form when she couldn't even please him as his personal servant. Surely, he would definitely refuse to accommodate her wishes tomorrow in traveling in his wolf form because of what happened tonight and the sudden mention of her so-called fear of nudity. Knowing how active his brain was, he would surely slap her with the excuse that it would simply be better to keep on traveling as it is, not shifting on and off from his wolf form. Chapter 24. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Darius's line on his forehead continued to wrinkle as he eyed Zen. He was getting anxious, seeing the various expressions playing on the lad's face. The worst, however, was when the lad would bite his lower lip. It was annoying as hell for him, how the action somehow had an intense effect on him. Finally removing his gaze from him, he was mortified when he bowed his head and glanced at his erection growing under the water. This isn't good, Darius frustratingly thought. In response, he bathed in a rush and quickly got dressed. You can now open your eyes, Zen. For goodness sake. Darius chided. Hearing him, Zen slowly opened his eyes. He straightened her back and raised his chin when he saw that he already had his trousers on. He had an awkward smile as he whispered, "Thank you so much, Your Majesty, for understanding my situation. Again, I apologize for any inconvenience." Move to the corner, Darius instructed. You're going to sleep beside me. Darius, finally on the verge of his patience, snapped, and do you want me to sleep on the floor? Don't you see that there's only one bed and it's big enough for more than 3 people alone? He let out a sigh of relief when Zen just moved to the side of the bed and let him lay comfortably beside him. Darius could tell what Zen was thinking as the lad stared at him in disbelief. What? It's normal for a servant to sleep in the same bed as their king. You're my warrior. Servant Zen, so you also have to look after me. What if I have a nightmare, Zen? So relax and clear those doubts that are way too visible on your face. Stop sighing and rest. We have another long day tomorrow, and I want to sleep early, Darius murmured, hoping Zen would simply obey without any more questions. But to his disappointment, Zen moved to get up from the bed. He opened his eyes and asked, "What now?" "I haven't cleaned up, Your Majesty, and I need to go to the privy chamber for a while," Zen murmured. "Okay, go," Darius said and watched Zen move towards the small room. He had asked for a chamber with complete amenities, so he watched Zen enter the door and watched him come out and clean his teeth and face in the distance. Such graceful movements for a lad, he suspiciously observed. Zen was hiding something just based on the inconsistency of his alibis alone. First, there was an arranged marriage, and now a fear of nudity. He wondered what other reasons he would have next to become a wanderer as their journey together continued. Darius watched as Zen carefully walked towards him but paused as his eyes darted towards the small chair and table inside the room. "What are you waiting for? Come to bed and sleep," Darius commanded. "Don't keep your king waiting. And don't you dare tell me you have a fear of sleeping beside someone. It would be too ridiculous to believe." Sensing the lad come forward with soft footsteps and climb on the bed, Darius heaved a sigh of relief. After a while, he carefully turned to face Zen's back, making sure that the latter was already asleep. "He sleeps so easily," Darius murmured with a sigh. He wondered how long he would be in this limbo of confirming Zen's gender. "Your problem will easily go away if you would just strip her right here and now." Zeus grunted, becoming rather impatient as well. "Let's sleep, Zeus. Stop tempting me with your barbaric ways. Zen is not like us. He is a human, and we should respect his beliefs even if he belongs to me now." Darius mentally chided. "If we do it your way and he turns out to be a woman, do you think she will even accept me afterwards? She would deny me, and I don't want to force a woman just because she's my mate. You do know that I still don't believe in mate pull. I will do what I want and get any woman I want, even if she's not my mate." "Yeah, and you can't deny that you want Zen." So stop with the boring speeches and just let me rest if you plan to do things your way. Zeus chided. Darius rolled his eyes and mentally murmured, "You're the one who interrupted me, suggesting your barbaric ways." Zeus only answered him with a snarl. Hearing him, Darius sighed and closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would knock on his doorway soon. But sleep was too fleeting to his aid. Darius's eyes were wide open as he moved and absent-mindedly stared at the ceiling. "He mentioned about an arranged marriage, Zeus." Darius murmured to Zeus. "Precisely, you Dumbo. She's a woman escaping an arranged marriage. She's wearing a disguise to keep herself from being discovered, don't you think?" Such a conclusion made sense, and instantly, Darius's eyes lit up with hope. "How about you do this? Hug her now and pretend to accidentally touch her chest and grab a feel of her breasts. Take note of your thoughts and actions. Don't push me too hard. You look like a pervert in heat. Wait till we find out more about Zen, and for goodness sake, you better be right. Or else I will kill you myself." Darius grunted. Zeus growled and whined, "I am right. I can smell her perfectly. You're simply stupid." Darius only sighed as he moved to his side and faced Zen's back again. He obviously wanted Zen beside him despite the torment on his part. Darius moved closer to Zen and buried his face in Zen's nape. The lad's intoxicating smell was so pleasant that he had difficulty controlling himself from just approaching him and sniffing him to his heart's content. Zeus was right, he wanted nothing more than to pull Zen closer and bury his teeth in Zen's neck to mark and claim him as his. Chapter 25. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It was still dark when Xenia finally woke up. She smiled, snuggling into the warmth that she was feeling. However, a frown formed on her face, her eyes fluttering open in shock. She blinked several times and gulped. If she was right, then her face was currently brushing against Darius's hard but warm chest. What's going on? Xenia thought in a panic. Her legs were even intertwined with him. It was like she was a pillow entwined into his embrace. And what was even more terrifying was how her arm was currently wrapped around his waist as well. Did she really just do that? Embracing him like this? It was like they were cuddling. No, they were really cuddling each other for sure. Xenia could feel the drumming of her heart inside her chest. Her face was glowing red, and she didn't know what to do. But one thing was for sure, she had to break free from her precarious position without waking Darius up. Moving carefully, Xenia tried to free herself, but Darius's hold on her was too tight. He suddenly moved, and she froze. Slowly, she tilted her head to look at his face. She unconsciously sighed, seeing how he seemed to still be in a deep sleep. Looking at the window, the sun was about to rise at any moment, so she should move quickly if she didn't want to get caught in an awkward position with him. It would be too embarrassing, not to mention how she was already feeling weird with the unexplainable tingling sensations running throughout her body. Xenia filled her lungs with air, and, with a great force, freed herself from Darius's hold in one fluid motion. She then quickly moved to the corner of the bed, turning her back on him for the fear that he would wake up after her stunt. She closed her eyes, cringing at the corner like a curled-up shrimp. She bit her lower lip as she waited. When she was finally sure that she was free, Xenia let herself relax her body. She should really be getting up by now before the sun rises. She was about to move, but her body stiffened when she felt Darius's strong arm move over her flat waist, pulling her in with one swift motion. "What the hell?" she gasped, mortified. Her thoughts froze as her body became a statue, especially when she felt his warm breath moving behind her nape. Oh, how she regretted bowing her head now, giving Darius unrestricted access to her bare nape. Based on his deep breathing, he seemed to still be in a deep sleep. Still, that didn't mean she shouldn't be careful. Xenia gulped, firmly grabbing Darius's arm and removing it from her waist. She then almost jumped out of the bed, panting as if she had just wrestled with a polar bear. Looking back, she turned and glared at Darius, who seemed to be unbothered from all of the commotion with his eyes still closed. Is he seriously still asleep after that? Damn. You could easily kill this man in his sleep. Xenia silently beamed as she walked towards the door. The sun was already up, and she better go get some fresh air and get rid of the sweat she had because of Darius's closeness. Everything seemed and felt new to her, and she felt conflicted and confused with how her body was feeling and reacting to Darius. Anyhow, she didn't like it, and most certainly did not want to entertain whatever it was that seemed to be going on. As soon as Zen went out, Darius opened his eyes, absent-mindedly staring at the ceiling as he whispered, "I'm going insane." "You're stupid. You can pretend to accidentally touch her chest and grab a feel, but you chose to touch her belly instead. You dummy." Zeus growled. Darius only chuckled, "It's fun though." He was obviously having fun teasing Zen despite the torment on his part. Besides, it was great control practice to try and restrain his carnal urges for the lad. Absolutely insane. Zeus bombarded. Yet the smile on Darius's face faded and a servant entered and introduced himself as someone asked by his companion to help him with getting ready. Seeing the stranger, Darius's face soured as he hissed, "Leave, I don't need assistance." Watching the servant leave, Darius immediately got ready before going outside to look for Zen with a crumpled face. Xenia embraced herself as she let the cool morning breeze wash across her face. It was another morning, and yet another day of her regretting her decisions about running away from their kingdom. Looking out, the light rays of the sun were starting to shine brightly. She knew that Darius would wake up soon, and she had to somehow assist him in getting ready like the pampered king that he was. Walking out, the innkeeper greeted Xenia outside. She smiled as she requested, "Could you please inform His Majesty that I'll be at the dining area making sure that the table is ready for breakfast?" "I will do so, my lord. I shall take your leave now." At her word, the innkeeper politely bid her leave, and Xenia soon found herself walking back inside to check on their breakfast detail. Judging from the sun's position, Darius should already be awake. It would only mean that she had to do her job now. Soon enough, Xenia saw the king walking towards her. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Xenia politely greeted with a bright smile, hoping that the king would spare her any more grief this morning. As if on cue, she quickly stood up and pulled out a chair for him. "Breakfast is ready, Your Majesty. Please take a seat." The king sat on the chair with a frown. Already, Xenia could sense that he was annoyed with how down his face currently was, but she ignored it by keeping a smile on her face as she apologetically said, "Your Majesty, I apologize if I was unable to assist you as soon as you woke up." Stop, Zen. I don't want to hear any more of your excuses," Darius cut her off, raising a hand to stop her from speaking. "We'll talk about it later once we come back to Cordon. There, I will decide whether or not to keep you or throw you straight into the pit," he exclaimed before turning his attention to the breakfast served to them instead. Hearing his threats, Xenia gulped as she quietly harumphed, "HMPPH. As if I'll ever come back with you after all of this," but then, she found herself frowning as she considered her options. Maybe a pit is in many ways better than getting married to a vampire and living in a kingdom populated by a majority of blood-sucking vampires. At least in a pit, she would be able to fight for her honor, dignity, and her freedom. However, she quickly dismissed the thought since it would also mean that her sister Mini would take her place once again. It was sickening. Doing that to her beloved sister just didn't sit well in the incognito princess's stomach. Chapter 26. You are listening at novelfull.audio. They finished the breakfast in silence. In the end, Xenia had no choice but to travel with the king on a single horse again. And yet despite knowing this, she still tried her luck by saying, "Your Majesty, don't you want to travel faster? Like using your wolf for?" "No," the king firmly answered, cutting her off in an instant. At the echo of his voice, Xenia gulped. "Grumpy beast, she wanted to voice out but held her tongue. As she expected, there was simply no way that Darius would accommodate her request for him to change into his wolf form so they could travel faster. And that was all because she was unable to please this brute king with his so-called warrior-servant thing. Maybe tonight, I should actually try serving him well, Xenia thought to herself. So what if I'll be able to see his privates? Ha! It's not like it's something great to see. Maybe I should just think of it as practice since I'll get married soon. I might as well familiarize myself with seeing a naked man, she justified the situation to herself with a sigh. It's nothing different from healing anyway, where you need to study the human anatomy to be better at your craft. Why are you sighing, Zen? Nothing, Your Majesty, Xenia whispered, barely managing to stop herself from rolling her eyes as she replied. Along their travels, they stopped every once in a while to take a break in the shade of the forest. King Darius also let the horse drink some water and recuperate while they readjusted their bearings. According to him, the forest they were in was a shortcut that would lead them to another village near the border of Ebodia. As they returned to the road, King Darius had wolves following him, often making sure to gaze through their eyes to look out for possible danger. Xenia knew that werewolves could talk telepathically, but she wasn't sure if they could also do it with animals as well. She found herself wondering if they were even real wolves, or if they were baby werewolves in their animal forms. After the wolves left, Xenia casually asked, "Are they also werewolves? Are they babies? Or are they simply normal wolves?" "They are wolves, Zen," Darius neutrally replied. "They're guiding me towards the right path inside the forest." "I see," she nodded. "So you guys can also talk to animals and understand each other. Is that applicable to all animals or is it just for wolves?" Xenia curiously asked. It was there that she realized that she lacked the proper knowledge of her current situation. The knowledge that she probably would have learned by now if she didn't skip the boring classes about it with Minnie. Back then, she would often sneak out and look for her older brother, Ezekiel, in the training ground and practice her combat skills with him. "Just wolves," Darius plainly answered. Getting her answer, Xenia found herself looking at the clear water where the horse was drinking. She stared at her reflection. As she leaned forward, Darius looked at her back and squinted at her. "Just push her in the water. That way, she'll get drenched and you can tell her to change her clothes." Zeus grunted. "Help her change her clothes then. Please, just end your misery by thinking whether or not Zen is a male or female." "Zen, grab your sword," Darius instructed. Zen turned, his eyes widening as he saw Darius aiming his sword right at him. "Your Majesty. What are you doing?" Zen asked with a frown. "Grab your sword now while I'm still being nice," Darius warned. "I'm already doing my best not to slash your," Darius warned. "You mean slash her clothes, right? But that would be weird to say." "Ah, so you prefer removing her clothes using your blade? What a naughty move." Zeus excitedly snarled. His inner wolf was anticipating the next thing that could happen. When Zen refused to move, Darius swung his sword at him. He was about to slash the fabric on Zen's chest, but the lad quickly dodged the attack and grabbed his own sword as he positioned for a defense. "What is wrong with you?" Zen yelled. "I'm stripping off your clothes." Darius smirked, mentally barking on the back of his head. Understandably, Darius ignored Zen's violent reaction to his aggression and continued attacking her with all his might, slicing every piece of clothing he could from her as he advanced. "Are you enjoying this? Is this really better than just pushing her to the water?" Zeus impatiently commented as he watched the scene between Zen and Darius unfold. Either way, the two seemed like they would take centuries to finish up just because of how fast Zen was moving to dodge and weave herself away from him. Having had enough, Zen finally unsheathed her sword, her sharp gaze landing on Darius as she grunted, "Your Majesty, you started this. So don't you blame me if we both end up getting wounded." She then started parrying the king's advance as she continued, "Just what the hell is going on with you suddenly attacking me like this anyway? Are you being possessed by an evil spirit right now?" Darius tried his best not to chuckle at how Zen was trying to justify her own violent actions. It was laughable, to say the least. This isn't making any sense. Let's just talk to her nicely. Ask her directly perhaps. Zeus concluded. Darius, who had finally gathered enough of his senses, simply drew his sword back as he asked Zeus, "Do you even think she will tell us the truth? Because I highly doubt that." It's still worth it to try, don't you think? Yes, you're right. There's no harm in trying. I'll just talk to Zen and ask. What we're doing now is too childish for my liking. Look how terrified Zen looks right now. Darius inwardly scoffed, making Zeus laugh at the absurdity of the situation as well. Especially now, that Zen's face was turning paler by the second. Chapter 27. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I simply wanted to test your alertness at this current moment, the king smoothly lied. You are my warrior.servant, are you not? You see, your duty is to protect me with your life. As such, I am checking if you're even worthy of such a position, given your propensity at being disrespectful to your king and savior more often than not. Xenia, upon hearing his words, was left speechless. She was utterly dumbfounded by the king's constant mood swings. Is he being serious right now? What a weird king, she annoyingly grunted in her mind. It was then that he suddenly slashed at the fabric on her shoulders, the damage exposing her arms and collarbone. See? You're not alert enough. Always keep your guard up. Sorry about that. I have a spare tunic. How about changing into them now? Darius quickly offered. Here, I will help you. No, Xenia quickly responded, her face falling further by the second. Ignoring her protest, Darius moved closer to her with his eyes squinted on her. The incognito princess gulped at how intense and fierce his eyes were staring at her as if he was searching for her very soul within the depths of her eyes. Stepping back as he kept moving closer, she was startled when she felt her back hit the trunk of a tree. She was about to move away, but the king had already cornered her with his arms caging her in from both sides. "Why, your majesty," she whispered out, her eyes staring back into his as her lips hung open. King Darius groaned as his eyes gravitated towards her lips. Meanwhile, Xenia blinked at what she saw within his eyes. It was the same as before. His eyes seemed to be filled with desire, and she didn't know what was happening anymore as she felt herself becoming affected by how close their bodies were at the moment. It was weirdly intoxicating, feeling his familiar warmth. Wait. Was this king attracted to men? She was still clearly in his male disguise. Or was he somehow able to see through her ruse? She couldn't help but wonder if the werewolf inside him could sniff out her gender somehow. What if? Xenia's eyes widened at the thought of her disguise being blown. You. King Darius whispered out in his hoarse tone. Why, your majesty? What are you doing? Xenia gulped. Please let me. Stop moving, Zen, or I swear you won't like what I'll do to you next. Darius threatened with a grunt, as his breath blew on Zen's ear. His inner self tried hard to calm himself despite the intoxicating scent surrounding him. Those parted lips of hers were already driving him such insane thoughts, that it took a lot out of him simply not to ravish them. He found himself wondering if what he was feeling was normal, and how long he would be able to suppress this intensity of a mate pull. It was already tormenting enough to even be able to breathe the same air as Zen for such a short time. He could just imagine himself inhaling her scent to his heart's content, treating it as if it was some kind of relaxing aroma that could somehow tone down the undeniable carnal desires building up in his body. Tell me, Zen. Are you really a man? Because you smell different, Darius weakly whispered, his mouth moving closer to Zen's as he questioned. Are you aware that my wolf recognizes your scent? How about you tell me the truth right now? Xenia swallowed hard at the challenge. Chills ran all over her body as the king's warm breath breezed through her ear, the sensation making her shiver with some kind of unexplainable feeling. But one thing was for sure, it was not because of fear. Biting her lower lip, she contemplated whether or not to tell him the truth. Xenia moved to open her mouth, but she stopped herself when a sudden loud howl echoed in the distance. What was that? Xenia gasped. At the perceived threat, Darius quickly moved and stripped in front of Xenia. He barked out, "Gather everything quickly. I'll shift into my wolf form. Hop onto me and hold on tightly. Danger is coming, and the wolves are already giving me a warning." Heeding the king's call, Xenia quickly moved to gather their belongings, completely ignoring how Darius was currently naked before her as he quickly shifted into his wolf form. Immediately, she hopped onto his back and did as he asked. As soon as she was finally secured and settled onto his back, Darius began running as fast as he possibly could. Darius growled as he ran. The wolves were informing him that a particular army from the kingdom of Helion was on their way and that they were almost nearing their general direction. In response, he immediately sent a message through some of the wolves to pass on to his midnight knights so that they could check the situation on why an army from the kingdom of Helion would be marching through the forest. Could they be? Darius inwardly cursed. An army of this size marching from the kingdom of Helion could only mean one thing. Their next target of conquest could be the kingdom of Ebodia. Darius clenched his jaw. Only now did he somehow understand some of the decisions the king of Ebodia had made, even resorting to an alliance even if it was through marriage. He had to move fast and at least warn Ebodia of the coming danger they had to face. If his hunch was right, it was the king of Helion's way of giving his regards for both of the kingdoms' pending wedding and alliance. It would have been such a bold and challenging move if it wasn't so despicable. Chapter 28. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As soon as Darius finally slowed down his pace, Xenia felt her breath come back. She heaved a sigh of relief. She had been unused to the blistering speeds the king had run with, his wolf form being so fast that she had felt dizzy after only a brief sprint. Still, she could sense that something was wrong with the general area, which was the reason why Darius ran like that in the first place. But as much as she wanted to learn what was amiss, he was in his wolf form. As such, there was no way that she could communicate with him. Instead, she had no choice but to grab onto his fur for dear life. The king refused to stop running, though he had considerably slowed down already after the danger had seemingly passed. Even so, Xenia didn't dare interrupt him. After all, him running at high speeds also meant that they could arrive at their destination earlier than scheduled. Some time had passed, and Xenia no longer knew how long and far they had been traveling. However, she did know that it had been a while, seeing as she already felt so exhausted and hungry. By the time Darius finally stopped and bent down, the incognito princess let out a sigh of relief. It was the cue for her to step down from the wolf, but Xenia made sure to fix her wig first before doing so. Even while exhausted and weakened with hunger, she had no plans for her disguise to be blown, especially now that Darius seemed highly suspicious of her already. Ha! His wolf could probably smell something on me. But there's no way for him to prove anything unless he strips me. Surely he wouldn't do that, would he? Xenia apprehensively thought, but she was quickly snapped back to reality upon hearing Darius growl at her. Impatient wolf. Mentally barking back at the stubborn king, she quickly disembarked from his back. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she immediately filled her lungs with air as she readied herself for the next improbable thing that could happen to her interesting life. And lo and behold, that thing was the king shifting back into his human form. It was just as embarrassing as last time, but unlike before, she fully faced him this time, her eyes keenly staring at the wolf before him as she readied his clothes. Bring it on. Psyching herself up, Xenia mentally challenged the coming trial with a sharp gaze aimed towards Darius. So what if she'd get a full view of him shifting back into his human form completely naked? Maybe as soon as she managed to not even bat an eye, Darius would finally stop being curious about her gender. He was just probably trying to find out more about her because of his wolf's instincts. Then again, such a hypothesis would have no way of being confirmed other than having her clothes completely stripped off her body. Darius almost found his eyes going back to the ground when his gaze met with Zen's, whose sharp and piercing eyes were peculiarly fixed in his general direction. He gulped as he quietly murmured, "What's with the intense stare?" Meanwhile, his wolf Zeus was laughing at his misfortune. It seemed amused with how Zen was keenly staring at him like she was about to scale a mountain. "What are you waiting for, you dumbass? Can't you see how she's already waiting for you to show her your naked body?" Zeus barked out. "Why don't you give her the honor of feasting her eyes on your majestic body? Hurry before she changes her mind and suddenly turns around away from you," the wolf teased, unable to hide his amusement with the two's constant bickering. To his own surprise, Darius, for the first time in his life, suddenly felt so conscious about his next move that he took his time in deciding what to do. Seeing the unusual dilemma, Zeus burst out in yet another fit of laughter. Darius groaned in annoyance as he suddenly shape-shifted into his human form to stop Zeus from talking and teasing him. As the king began his transformation, Xenia bit her inner cheek hard as she braved the front-row view of how Darius changed back into his human form. It was the first time she had an utterly detailed view of it unfolding before her eyes. In some ways, it was a much closer view than she had anticipated, her lips parting unknowingly while her eyes were fixated on Darius. It was mesmerizing. The whole process played out in such a way that she could no longer take her eyes off him. Before she even knew what was happening, the king was completely naked before her, her eyes barely managing to blink as soon as she realized what was currently in front of. Oh my, to his credit, the king undeniably had the most astounding body she had ever seen. She swallowed a bit of her own courage as her inner thoughts slapped her back to reality. "And since when have you seen a naked man before? This is your first time seeing one in full view, Xenia." The princess mentally shook her head. It was true. Maybe there would be other men that could beat Darius's perfectly toned muscles. And as her eyes unconsciously wandered towards the lower part of his body, her eyes widened as a mad blush appeared on her face. The king held a wide smile on his face as he amusingly prompted, "Are you comparing your size to mine, Zen? I'm sure yours is comparable." At his insinuation, Xenia snapped herself back to reality as she quickly focused her gaze on his face with an amused facade of a smirk. Inwardly, she gulped, unable to find the right words to slap away the king's insinuation. She was too flabbergasted at the ridiculousness of the situation before her, not to mention how she was still burning red from embarrassment. "BL. Net, cover yourself up already, your majesty. It seems inappropriate for that thing of yours to stand at full mast even when there's no woman around." "Mine can only do so in the face of a true beauty," Xenia bravely scoffed. Chapter 29. You are listening at novelfull.audio. To her surprise, Xenia managed to counter the king without so much as a stutter. In fact, it went so much better than she expected that she actually wanted to congratulate herself, seeing how the king seemed to cower embarrassingly at her words. Suddenly, she felt grateful for all the time she spent hanging out with her brother, the knights, and the soldiers. It was because of them that she was able to pull off such an answer, something that sounded good enough to be seen as common to the usual manly banters after practice in the training grounds. Dnov on the other hand, Darius's face turned flaming red at the feeling of indignation. He had never felt this embarrassed in his entire life. Pursing his lips, he silently cursed his luck as Zeus laughed hard at Zen's direct challenge to the king. Enough of this. Having had enough, he abruptly grabbed his clothes from Zen, who looked wholly unaffected by his naked body unlike before. With a wave of his arms, he quickly covered his lower body to hide his erection. Surely, his manhood wouldn't react in such a way for no valid reason. Logically, his wolf must be correct, seeing as the only explanation for why his manhood would be erect like this whenever he was with Zen, would be that Zen was actually a woman. Darius was about to put on his clothes when he noticed how Zen's gaze constantly darted towards one particular spot. Frowning, he let out a short breath as an idea suddenly sprang up for him to test the lad a bit more. "It looks like you've healed faster from your disorder upon seeing a naked body, Zen. You're probably getting used to me, and like I assumed, I could be your way of healing completely," Darius bluntly called out. "If that's the case, come and help me get dressed already. And by the way, my manhood rarely stands at full mast like this, so I do wonder why it's even reacting this way." Seeing Zen's face turn red, he smirked at the small victory he earned for himself. Pressing his advantage, he lifted an eyebrow as he called for him again. "I said come here and help me get dressed, Zen." As if in a trance, Xenia snapped back to reality at the sound of Darius's persistent voice. Filling her lungs full of air, she prepared herself for another round of probing and subtle jabs. She shouldn't lose to this arrogant king, so she puffed up her chest and walked towards him, making sure that her eyes would no longer gaze at his massive manhood as she leveled her gaze. However, even in her thoughts, she was getting rather uncomfortable from mentioning his huge thing. She wondered if that was the normal size for men, but a part of her could tell that Darius's manhood seemed far too much. Gulping, the incognito princess quickly shook her head to erase the perverted thoughts from her mind as she walked towards him. Staring at him, she unceremoniously grabbed his clothes and began assisting him in clothing himself. With each movement, it became increasingly obvious that it was a struggle for Xenia. Every time their skin brushed against each other, a part of her burned in ways she couldn't describe, and it was utterly confusing since she was familiar with the company of men in her kingdom. Why hadn't she experienced something like this from any one of them? Maybe because the men in our kingdom are properly dressed, unlike this brute. Xenia inwardly reasoned out her feelings as she quickly put on Darius's cape. With a motion of her arms, she almost hugged him by his back as she tried her best not to meet his intense gaze with her eyes. Yes, she could still see his flaming eyes from the corner of her own vision, and it was getting so bothersome that she was having a hard time acting normally. Her stomach also started feeling weird, and snap out of it. With a frown, Xenia quickly finished what she was doing and immediately stepped back. Mentally shaking her head, she turned around and said, "We should start moving, Your Majesty. I believe we are still in danger, right? Seeing as you hastily shifted just now." "Yes, we are," King Darius, who was now walking beside her, replied. "Still, we have a bit of time." Half-heartedly listening to the king, Xenia just now finally managed to calm her weird body, the king cooperating with her as they talked about more pressing matters. The wolf saw an army from the kingdom of Helion approaching. "I believe that a particular army inside the forest intends to camp near the border of the kingdom of Ebodia," King Darius explained. "With this, I can only assume that Helion's next target is eventually Ebodia. They'll attack just before the wedding to prevent the alliance, while also taking advantage of the general lack of security. I've already relayed this information to my knights traveling with us, and have also assigned Gideon and Bardas to shape-shift and travel ahead of us to pass on this information to the king of Ebodia." Xenia's body froze. An attack on their kingdom. "We must hurry," she unconsciously uttered as she walked faster. No, she practically ran through the vast forest, not even knowing whether or not she was on the right track. This was bad. This was what her father feared the most, being attacked while being horribly unprepared. In the distance, another howl echoed from the wolves, making Darius's face darken as he looked beyond the horizon. Moving quickly, he shifted into his wolf-man form as he ran after Zen. Without warning, he then scooped Zen up, lifting him into his arms like a sack of grain as he kept on running. Eep! Xenia yelped as she was caught off guard by the action. However, she recognized that it was His Majesty who carried her in his arms. "We're in danger, Zen," he growled out. "They've managed to track us." Chapter 30. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xenia was unable to see King Darius properly since her head was on his back with the way he was carrying her over his shoulder. But she could only assume that he had shifted into his wolf-man form, seeing as there were only two hairy legs running beneath her. Craning her neck, she looked from right to left, stopping as soon as she saw the rogue werewolves following them. "Your Majesty, they'll catch up with us soon," Xenia warned. She shook her head. If only she had an arrow with her at that specific moment, then she could have probably at least managed to help Darius out in bringing down those rogue werewolves that were after them. Meanwhile, Darius inwardly cursed as he ran. Helion was known for using black magic, and the majority of his army were composed of all manners of undead creatures, including werewolves. With how the enemy was chasing them, they probably managed to trap one of the wolves he was communicating with, and they managed to learn that he was inside the forest after they were done with the poor thing. Looking behind them, Xenia kept her eyes peeled for any sort of attack. She kept herself alert, and the next thing that happened made Xenia's eyes widen in shock. "They're firing arrows at us," she yelled in horror. As they were completely defenseless, the best thing they could do was to run and hopefully lose the trail of their enemies. Already, Xenia felt so dizzy with how much Darius was varying up their movements in an effort to dodge all the arrows coming their way. Looking at it now, she honestly felt bad at how she was adding another burden to him by making him carry her weight like this. As they ran, another arrow came their way, but Darius quickly sensed it coming, so he moved to prevent the projectile from hitting their position. He didn't mind how another arrow was about to hit his body from another direction, and Xenia felt helpless that she couldn't do anything to at least try and help. "Can you swim?" Darius suddenly asked her. "Yes," she firmly answered. "Why?" "It's a dead end, and we need to jump to lose them," King Darius weakly informed. "Just make sure you cling on to me tightly, Zen." "Ah. I think the arrow's been laced with poison. I'm feeling weird. No matter what happens, Zen, please don't lose me." Having a proper look at Darius's wolf-man form, Xenia's eyes widened as he suddenly changed the way he was carrying her, securing her in his arms before jumping off a high cliff down to the raging water. Xenia's eyes widened at the unexpected danger. She couldn't even imagine what was worse, dying from drowning, or being captured by the ones currently chasing them. "Think fast, Xenia," with a harsh whisper, the princess collected herself and began to fix the situation. Racking her brain, she eventually remembered and managed to utter a spell that she learned from her mage friend, Jaira. Creating a magical thread, she bound herself with Darius in order for her to not lose him in the raging waters that carried them away. It was effective. The thread kept them from being separated even after she accidentally lost her grip on his arm due to the harsh currents. Thrashing against the water, Xenia managed to take a look at Darius, who was now back to his human form, under the water. She inwardly cursed at seeing how his eyes were closed. He was about to lose his consciousness, and she wasn't going to let him die. "Oh no, you don't." Cupping his face, she pressed her lips against his to give him some air, all while letting the water wash them away from the enemies. A few minutes later, the river calmed, and Xenia managed to steady themselves enough to let her fully raise hers and Darius's heads out of the water. She gasped for air as she kept Darius's face out of the water. Keeping her cool, she let the water carry them far enough for them to lose their enemies. Looking back, the cliff from where Darius jumped had been really high, and a human like her would have probably not survived the impact if not for Darius's protection. "I guess I can thank my lucky stars for that then." Xenia didn't know how long they had been drifting in the water, but she knew that it had been far longer than it should be. She should try and find their way back to land soon. The princess craned her neck back and forth, looking for some sort of exit strategy from the predicament they found themselves in. Seeing a tree branch hanging near the water, she immediately made herself drift towards it, grabbing onto it as soon as her hand could reach it. Gasping for air, she then gave it her all as she pulled herself and Darius back onto the land. She was panting hard as she pulled on the king's naked body, the man having shifted back to his human form the moment he lost consciousness. Thank the heavens, the princess thanked her lucky stars once more, seeing how Darius's other clothes were still securely tied to her person. Immediately untying them, she quickly fashioned a makeshift blanket for her to secure Darius's unmoving body, enabling her to pull his considerable weight with her as she walked forward. "You're heavy," she groaned. "Ah, I did a good job, right? I didn't lose you, my king," Xenia uttered, cheering herself as she kept her spirit high in pulling the king's heavy body. "No matter what happens then, please don't lose me," Darius's words kept replaying inside her head, and she could not help smiling. Xenia panted hard and paused to turn and look at the unconscious king. Somehow, it felt great hearing words like that, like someone depended on her. But then, this could be her opportunity to also escape from the king's grasp.